Alright, give me 2 or 3 more minutes and I shall be ready to start the last few chapters. Alright, we'll start very soon. So a lot of this is for my YouTube channel. If anyone who doesn't know, feel free to have a look. The rest of the book is on Helpless Mammal on YouTube. For those watching from YouTube, this is all recorded on Twitch. So if you'd like to come by, I'm just starting again to be on Twitch. So feel free to come over and enjoy the chat and enjoy yourself. Without further ado, we're gonna go on chapter 16. The Russian Schism and the Drone Offensive. Maybe it's pronounced schism actually. Red Swarm Federation was now the largest landowner in the history of EVE Online. Between Red Swarm and its close allies, the Federation's territories span half of New Eden. However, the empire Red Swarm had built so quickly had an unstable foundation. Few people at the time knew that the diplomatic union known as Red Swarm Federation had essentially fallen apart with the failure of the campaign to capture Del from Band of Brothers. Red Alliance, still an independent entity despite being part of Red Swarm, left the invasion due to its own internal strife, and Red Alliance's dissension was causing problems for its former allies as well. It started innocuously enough. Members of Red Alliance were caught using a valuable complex, a territory where players can hunt AI enemies to collect items and technology for profit, in Goonswarm territory in the early morning hours. Goonswarm asked them to stop using the complex, but the Red Alliance pilots refused. Despite repeated attempts to resolve the situation, Goonswarm and a small fraction of Red Alliance found themselves at odds. These Russian players were, after all, essentially stealing from Goonswarm by using its territory. This relatively small-scale problem with the complex ended up becoming the infraction that broke the alliance. Goonswarm called off its formal ties with Red Alliance, but it was something of a technicality. Goonswarm immediately established alliances with several corporations within Red Alliance, but declared those who were involved in the complex scandals to be enemies. Those who were declared to be enemies of Goonswarm were furious, and a great debate erupted within Red Alliance, with the enemies loudly proclaiming that the entire Red Alliance should declare war on Goonswarm. The relations between Goonswarm and the Russians were frayed, but not warlike. The prospect of a war declaration was refused. The Red Alliance corporation that Goonswarm declared to be enemies were now furious. And to make matters worse, my cat is freaking out. To make matters worse, where am I at? And the Goonswarm declared to be we're now blah, blah, blah. These corporations declared at their time. Whatever. The Red Alliance Corporation that Goonswarm declared to be enemies were now furious, and to make matters worse, here we are, their own people refused to back them up. These corporations declared that their time in Red Alliance was over, and moved to form their own new alliance, Red Overlord. Red Overlord's first order of business was to reach out to every other Russian faction in EVE Online, looking for help in attacking Goonswarm holdings. These efforts were all fruitless until it approached against all authorities, another clan or corporation. Just a couple of months ago, its leader, Evil Thug, was an ally of Goonswarm, but now he was prepared to go to war against the Goons. There are some interesting theories that explain his change of heart. Unfortunately, Evil Thug himself couldn't be contacted for this book. When Red Alliance left the main front of the Great Eve War during the assault on Delve, it was reportedly out of exhaustion and a growing sense of futility. But there's another reason why it suddenly stopped pushing in a 3-year long war. Dissension had sprung up within its ranks, and its pilots could no longer reach a clear consensus through their leadership. The leaders of the Red Alliance, Maktep and Death, had been heroes ever since the Red victory in the siege of SeaTac J6MT. Death, in particular, had become a very popular person within the Alliance who ruled through infamy. He began running his own fleet operations without approval from the Alliance Council, and people were following him. Resentment grew among the other corporation leaders within Red Alliance. This peaked during the Great Invasion of Band of Brothers Space in Delve when all of those Red Alliance leaders began leaving the front. Given little choice, Dead had to withdraw as well. All of the Russian forces arrayed against Band of Brothers, both Red Alliance against all authorities. They were both pulling back. There's a rumor about why this was happening, which I have to stress is completely unverified. The rumor goes that way, that a very wealthy Russian oil tanker tycoon began to get active in the Eve community and wanted to throw his weight around. Allegedly, this person wanted to shake up the political field. He is said to have paid real-world currency to high-ranking Russian players to abandon the front in Delve, and ultimately turn their backs on Goonswarm. It's a compelling story, but I'm not sure how much I believe it. This story is well known by the leaders of Nullsec, but there are always differences in how it is told depending on the storyteller. Sometimes he's a wealthy oil baron. Sometimes he's a shipping tycoon whose company primarily reparates in oil barges. Sometimes he's an aluminum magnate, or a rich friend of one of Eve's Russian leaders, or even the secret leader of Red Overlord. The stories even vary widely in the amounts he is supposed to have paid players, from 10,000 to 300,000 and everywhere in between. At this point, it seems certain that everyone I've heard this story from is at least somewhat wrong. There have always been larger-than-life rumors regarding the Russian sect of Eve players. People speak in hushed tones about Russian tycoons, mobsters, Russian players selling ISK on eBay and earning millions of rubles, tens of thousands in USD per month. I tend to distrust most of them since they're usually couched in stereotypical notions of Russian life. The rumors almost always uphold the vision of Russian players as corrupt, cheating, poverty-stricken thugs with ties to the mafia and or billionaire tycoons who are themselves tied to the mafia. These are particularly difficult rumors to prove or disprove because of the language barrier and sheer distance of the Russian community, which can often act as an entirely separate entity complete with its own forums and social platforms. This, non-coincidentally, is why a lot of these rumors take hold in the first place. To its credit, the rumor of the Russian oil tycoon shaking up the nullsec political field goes beyond the usual baseline. Xenophobia levied at the Russian Eve playing community by other players. This is a rumor that also persists with Russian players as well. I find myself grappling with this particular rumor because, if true, it explains a lot about Eve's history, not just in the Delve invasion, but with further reaching consequences as well. It would also explain the rift that was about to tear apart the entire Russian community. The exact reasons for this split are difficult to pin down. Russian community leaders are very difficult for an American English-speaking researcher to contact or interview. I don't speak the language, which means my options for sources are very few. This means that a number of safeguards are missing in the reporting process. I was able to find only a few good sources despite attempts to contact many others. Rather than leave you with no understanding of the Russian community, which would be a crime given that it's now the second largest nationality in Eve, I'll simply say that what follows is a one sided view, and you should mistrust it appropriately. According to Death, the rest of the Red Alliance Council was becoming jealous of this popularity and infamy in the Russian community. The war hero, as he described himself in our interview, had to be pushed out if they were going to get control back. Obviously, that's a one-sided story. I've heard similarly one-sided rumors that Death was no longer going along with the council, and it had no choice but to remove him. The real story is likely, as usual, that a communication breakdown struck Red Alliance's pilots. Their relationship were stressed, and they weren't communicating well enough to work out their differences. Regardless of the cause, Death left Red Alliance and formed his own alliance, Legion of Death. He left the traditional Russian regions in the southeast and headed north into the drone regions with several hundreds of ex-Red Alliance's members who opted to follow him. The Russians began to drift apart. Though they were few in numbers during the legendary stand and the siege of SeaTac J6MT in 2006, their legend spread through Russia and attracted thousands of new Russian-speaking players. Strong leaders within Red Alliance began to take control of their own powerful factions. In a very short period of time, relations within Red Alliance splintered and became four separate groups. Legion of Death and MacTip's Solar Fleet were the largest of the splintered organizations, approximately 700 members each, while Red Alliance soldiered on with far fewer members than it had before, roughly 1,600, and Red Overlord attracted about 400 members to follow it on its crusade against the goons that still raged on. The Drone Exodus. Up until this point in Eve's history, we haven't paid much attention to the drone regions. Released as part of a content expansion by CCP Games, the 8th Zone, which comprised the drone regions, were mostly ignored by the large nullsec powers for the first couple of years of their existence. In the game's lore, the drone regions were a larger frontier of unexplored star systems, with which the fictional in-game factions attempted to gain access to using large fleets of highly sophisticated autonomous drones. The drones, having a base form of sentience, took it upon themselves to populate the drone regions and form large drone hives that worked like space outposts. While they were plenty cool from a sci-fi point of view, the drone regions weren't particularly valuable territories. It's easy to imagine the predicament CCP Games would have found itself in when looking to introduce new nullsec territories. If it was to introduce highly rich and valuable new turf, it would be giving a huge advantage to whoever had easy access to those territories. The major powers didn't really care to control the drone region, and as a result, they became something of a haven for smaller alliances. The 8 new territories were a home to a dozen small groups, with most of them carving out a small piece of turf no larger than a dozen or so star system. That was all set to change now that the Great War was ostensibly over. Death took his fragment of the old alliance and departed from the traditionally Russian regions of Kash and Innsmouth, setting out in the Spire and Outer Passage, territories within the drone regions, to make a home of his own. The splintering in Red Alliance had continued. To hear Death tell the tale, MacTip's renown grew too great, and he too was forced out by the other leaders of Red Alliance. MacTip's Solar Flare fleet headed out in the drone regions to help out its old friends. By November 2008, Legion of Death and Solar Fleet had conquered all of the drone regions, and the Northern Coalition was none too pleased as the Russians had been conquering Northern Coalition's allies. Legion of Death, and I quote, and Solar Fleet took advantage of us being busy with Band of Brothers during the Maximum Damage War and took Cobalt Edge without any real resistance, said Voklau, the leader of the Northern Coalition. were a bit pissed because Legion of Death was meant to be one of the old anti-Band of Brothers allies. They should have been helping us, not backstabbing us. I think some of the Northern Coalition still had them marked as allies even as they were invading. Humble beginning to big wars. Meanwhile, in the south, Red Overlord was hell-bent on revenge against Goon Swarm, and it recruited against all authorities to start making raids on Goon Hell territory. Against all authorities had recently been given extra incentive to enter the war. It was reported that Goon Swarm leaders, Darius Johnson, had made an ill-considered remark that Against All Authorities could never defeat Goon Swarm in a head-to-head war. By now, Goon Swarm was exceedingly large, with many thousands of players. By contrast, these two Russian alliances, Against All Authorities, was predominantly Russian, but never really played along with the other Russian groups, were a fraction of the size. They only had one advantage: Evil Thug. After 5 years in EVE Online, Evil Thug was a terrifying figure. He commanded fierce loyalty from his pilots, and he was notoriously cavalier with his Titan. He was famous for committing his flagship to any fight he could find. And if it was just a couple of pirates whose ships were literally worth less than the ammunition he shot them with, nobody wanted to get in his way when he was on the warpath. Sorry, my throat is acting up. But even with the new allies, Stain Empire, a very old alliance that had resided in the south since nearly to the dawn of EVE Online, the small coalition made next to no gain when it attacked Goon Swarm-held 5th Abolus. Worse, mere days after the invasion began, the attacking coalition was already being pushed back into its home region. Seeing an opportunity to bring this small war to an early end, the goons stage an alarm clock operation. The idea behind this is that the mostly American goons were rarely playing EVE at the same time as the mostly Russian and European Red Overlord, and Against All Odds and authorities in the Stain Empire coalition. So the goons ordered a large number of their pilots, numbering in the hundreds, to set their alarm clocks for the very early morning, American hours, so they could wake up and get online to fight the Russians in their own time zone. The alarm clock operation was a huge success, and the goons were able to push Red Overlord back into its own staging systems where it housed its stores of ships. Goon Swarm established a blockade around Red Overlord's main station and began smothering it. Even during their off hours, the goons were still dominant. Red Overlord was going to be trapped inside its station for a very long time unless it could find a way to break the siege. But just as all hope faded for the humble coalition, Band of Brothers announced its intent to seize the maximum damage campaign in the north and join the fight against Goon Swarm in the south. What nobody knew at that time was that this was the beginning of the next stage of the Great War. The arrival of Band of Brothers in the south marked a turning point in the Young War, and the anti-goon coalition of alliances Red Overlord, Against All Authorities, Stain Empire, and Band of Brothers suddenly had the manpower to fight a much different kind of war that was previously possible. This coalition split apart, and each alliance attacked a different part of Goon Swarm's massive territory. It was the same strategy Red Swarm Federation had used against Band of Brothers during its hugely successful invasion of the South a year earlier, and now it was being used against Goon Swarm. Against All Authorities and a smattering of smaller alliances hid the goons in Esoteria, while Red Overlord focused on 5th Abolus, and Band of Brothers and its stalwart ally Executive Outcomes attacked Wicked Creek. The attack on Wicked Creek was particularly problematic for Goon Swarm. It was the former territory of Tau Ceti Federation, which had only weeks before packed its bags and moved it to Decline in the north to settle in a new home. Band of Brothers was invading effectively vacant turf And worse, nobody in Goonswarm really cared about it. There was no inspiration to fly out and defend a region the Goons had never owned. But to the outside world, it looked terrible, as though Band of Brothers was making a steady march through ex-Red Swarm territory. Much of the information that survives about this time period was recorded in retrospect in a series of columns for the Eve fansite Crossing Zebras, written by a Goonsworn pilot who called himself HVAC Repairman. No doubt a playful jab about the Goon's hated enemy, Sir Molly, and the discovery of his past as a manager at a heating and cooling installation repair company. I've had HVAC Repairman's account of events fact-checked by leaders of the opposite side of the conflict, and his original essays serve as an invaluable starting point for learning how this era of history progressed. Enemies flooded into every corner of Goonsworn space, and the Goons faced the same problems Band of Brothers had in defending itself a year prior. The problem wasn't that Goonswar couldn't win battles, but that the logistics were a nightmare. Goonswarm logisticians had trouble ensuring that Goonswarm's fleet were equipped and ready to defend in any of the half-dozen locations they might be attacked. In the confusion, Goonswarm began to lose ground in Esoteria. The Against All Authorities led forces had conquered the capital system of Esoteria, C9N DAC CC. With Esoteria under the control of Against All Authorities, it continued pushing into Omist with the goal of snapping a chain of jump bridges which were allowing Goonswarm extremely rapid access to Omist, Tenerife, and Fithabolis. Without this jump bridge, Goonswarm's ability to rapidly reinforce its fleet and respond to threats would be even further diminished. Goonswarm fought hard to defend R2 TJ TAC 1, where the jump bridge was kept, and through 3 days of battles, it managed to keep the attacking forces at bay. However, unknown to the Goons, a spy hidden within Goonswarm had managed to worm their way into the role of managing the star bases inside that system. Late one night, just before the server reset, and thus when it was about to calculate sovereignty, the spies simply unchecked a single box on each of the star bases. The box that dictates whether the starbase will be used to make a sovereignty claim. When the EVE Online server came back up an hour later, Goonswarm no longer had sovereignty, and thus its jump bridge was offline. It would be another 4 weeks before it'd have jump bridge access back online. These were key victories for the coalition of alliances fighting against the Goons, but they amounted to a slow and steady march. They were winning the fight, but Goonswarm was also doing an impressive job of holding on despite the massive amount of star system it was being asked to defend. After mopping up the last remnants of Band of Brothers' maximum damage campaign in the north, Pandemic Legion was now also free to head south and aid Goonswarm in the fight against Bands of Brothers. Little has been said so far about Pandemic Legion because until this time, it was largely a bit player in the larger galactic drama. But it was at this time that it came into its own as a mercenary force. Pandemic Legion's pilots believed themselves to be part of the very best combat outfit in New Eden, and their compatriots included a great many leaders and fleet commanders from former powers. Among these was Shadow, who formerly led the effort to crush the former Red Alliance Empire prior to the siege of C-TAC-J. The experienced commanders of Pandemic Legion were famous for inventing new types of fleet strategies that evolved the game and took their enemies entirely off guard. As they grew in strength, they began to think themselves more as kingmakers and mercenaries. They knew that their formidable presence was enough to tip the scales in most wars. So rather than trying to conquer the star cluster themselves, they stood on the sidelines and acted as a sort of Illuminati to decide who would conquer and who would fall. Alliances were piling into the conflict one by one, and the slow and steady creep of the war was about to change. The actions of one disgruntled pilot were about to change the course of this war and the entire history of EVE Online. Chapter 17: The Great EVE War, Part 3. On the morning of February 3rd, 2009, the leader of Goon Swarm's spy agency, the Metani, was eating a croissant in his office in Washington, D.C. As he nibbled the pastry, he had an epiphany. He just thought of a way to defeat an alliance of thousands of his sworn enemies without firing a shot. Three days earlier, a Goon Swarm member named Tamik Lank had been monitoring local chat channels, working as a Goon Swarm recruitment agent. Sometimes he invited players into the alliance, but sometimes he scammed them. This time he was scamming, known as a recruitment scam. The idea is to invite someone to join your corporation and then charge them a recruitment fee, before kicking them out, of course, or offer to help them transport their belongings to their new corporate headquarters, before kicking them out, of course, stealing their stuff and destroying their ship. Tamir Lank came across a typical mining character named Harkani and decided he'd found his next mark. But once they started talking, something about Harkani struck his sympathy, and he decided to allow the new recruit to stay in Goon Swarm. Harkani became a low-level Goon Swarm member. She was gifted a new mining ship and given a tour of the asteroid belt she'd have access to. Other goons seemed to like her, and she seemed to like being a member. There was no sign of a problem, until a standard background check turned up red flags. Most alliances have strict safeguards to protect themselves against spies. Their intelligence specialists conduct background checks on the new recruits to see who they've allied with in the past. In some cases, they even check new recruits' IP addresses to see if they match with any of their own enemies. So if you guys didn't know, I don't know if back then that was a thing, but there's a lot of metadata that you can actually extract from the game, and you can give that control to other people. It does not give them control over your account. They can't change anything in there, but they can just shuffle through your metadata of your character and see what were your fights, like where you were in the past, and a bunch of different things. I'm not so knowledgeable about it, but I do know that that's something you can do, and then big corporation will do to you if you ask to join. In the case of Arcani, Goon Swarm counterintelligence discovered that she had past affiliation with enemies of the Goon Swarm. They had no idea who the player behind Arcani really was, but they knew that something wasn't right, and the on-duty intelligent workers were concerned that they'd catch hell from their bosses if they let her stay. Arcani was asked to leave the Alliance, but she was enjoying herself and didn't want to go. As Goon Swarm officials moved to forcibly remove her from the Alliance, Arcani played her last card. "How happy would you be if I could provide intel about BOB, Bands of Brothers?" she asked Tamir Lank. "I'm going to be completely honest with you. My main character is in Band of Brothers. Director, full access to forums and RC, and I'm sick of this shit there. So I'm willing to be a spy for you guys." The redacted word was either removed by a profanity filter or manually scrubbed to keep the information from being deleted when Tamir Lank ultimately posted it on the forums. Arcani was telling the truth. Her main character was the male character Hargoth Argamar, a director in Band of Brothers. Specifically, Hargoth was one of the directors who helped run the Alliance's industry. He had been using the character of Arcani as a sort of vacation to play Eve away from the stress of the main alliance. He explained that he was fed up with the politics and internal problems in Band of Brothers. He wanted out. He was willing to do whatever it took to stay in Goon Swarm. "I'm pretty much sick of everyone thinking BOB is awesome when really the average member is retarded now, and the leadership is all emo and can't even stick to the fucking plan," he just told Tamir Lank. Holy moly, this is harsh. This confession shook the recruitment specialists. They were afraid that this was actually some kind of brilliant meta scam that they didn't yet understand. Lank remarked that this paranoia meter was off the charts. They called for the Mittani, leader of the Goonswarm intelligence agency, to wade in. The Mittani sends his regards. The Mittani heard Arcani out. He was skeptical. He asked Arcani to prove his identity by providing logging information for his corporation forums, the Black Nova Corporation, which would allow Goonswarm intelligence agents to keep up on BNC's tactical maneuverings. Arcani obliged, and he went one step further and gave up the logging information for the main Band of Brothers Alliance forums as well. Those forums included the secret meeting place for the Alliance's bigwigs known as La Barra de la Jefes, the Bar of the Bosses. In addition, he offered his continued services to Goonswarm as a spy. The leaders of Goonswarm weren't sure exactly what to do with this new turncoat. They had two choices. They could leave Arcani as an agent of the top of Band of Brothers and patiently wait to see what intelligence he could deliver, or they could mount what they called a smash and grab. Using the character of Argoth Agamar to steal as many ships as possible until he was caught. Leaving him as an intelligence agent was the riskier path because they had no idea how long he'd be able to serve. He might be caught right away, or demoted, or he could have a change of heart and start feeding Goonswarm bad information. They decided that a smash and grab heist was the best choice. Argoth had one more surprise in store. He revealed that not only was he a director of Band of Brothers, he was also director in Tin Foil, the shell corporation which served as the executor of the Band of Brothers Alliance. It served no purpose other than the corporation which registered the alliance, and the only members of Tin Foil were the highest-ranking Band of Brothers leaders from each corporation, who used this shell corporation to take alliance-level votes. This arrangement wasn't unusual. Many alliances used a vacant corporation to register their alliance so that no individual corporation in the alliance had too much power. But it created a unique vulnerability. Tin Foil was like the spine of this book. Without it, the page would flutter everywhere. I realize, I quote, that if he was a full director in Tin Foil, then he could disband the alliance. The Mittani explained in a speech delivered on February 5, 2009, I quote again, that he could go through and kick everyone out of BOB, that we could then seize the Bob name. Working through the night, the Mittani and 5 other GIA leaders worked together in a plan to end the alliance known as Band of Brothers. And the night of February 4, Arcani, playing as the Band of Brothers director character Argoth Agamar, logged into EVE Online and docked his ship at the headquarters of Black Nova Corporation, one of the main member corporations of Band of Brothers. From Band of Brothers, Arcani stole 15 dreadnoughts and an entire ship hangar containing hundreds of smaller ships. Everything is smaller than dreadnoughts. He also stole a huge amount of strontium, starbase, and dreadnought fuel. He made his way through the inventories containing the holdings of his own corporation, coldly moving every last mineral, barrel of fuel, and round of ammunition into his private hangars. With a few clicks, he stole everything his corporation owned. In the empty hangar folders, he left just a single item, a note with one sentence written on it. The Mittani sends his regards. That's gold. When he was done with his theft, he went to work ending the entire alliance. He removed the other directors from their position and closed the alliance. Band of Brothers ceased to exist. With no alliance on record named Band of Brothers, every one of its sovereignty claims was instantly dropped. Goonswarm then swiftly created their own empty alliance called Band of Brothers, so the name could never be used again. Band of Brothers had claimed sovereignty 4 in every system in Delve, but after Argoth Agamar struck, there was no longer an alliance called Band of Brothers. As a result, all of the star bases owned by BOB went offline without an alliance to control them. When the EVE Online server came back online, it found no active star bases in Delve and concluded that nobody owned the region. The equipment, star bases, outposts, shipyards, and jump bridges were still theirs, but Band of Brothers members' alliances had lost their sovereignty. Their capital systems were no longer invulnerable, and they had no way to stop enemy alliances from bringing heavy artillery right into the heart of Band of Brothers' empire. It was one of the very, very rare moments when the people in BOB had my phone number actually called me and said, "We have a problem," said Dianabolic. The sovereignty clock started over at zero once the BOB leaders got everything in order in their new alliance, which they named Kenzoku, a Japanese word meaning family. It was an incredible insult to force Band of Brothers to take a new name, but leaders within Band of Brothers tried to play it off like they didn't care. This prompted the Mittani to gleefully mock them. "I didn't want that alliance anyway," he teased. I asked Sir Molly what was going through his mind during this historical event. I quote, "Utter disbelief. I'm being more than angry as well as disappointed," he said. I'm sorry, this is written weird. He said, describing his in the moment reaction. "Trust was always a big thing with us, and it's clear that there is no such thing. To say that I'm pissed off is a mild understatement, but I'm not really sure who to be pissed off at. I'm pretty sure that somehow we messed this up ourselves, not knowing what mechanics would allow something like this to happen. What's important for us now is to do something, and bloody fast, and to shrug it off, and try to play it so we can come out of the mess we got ourselves into. In the heartbeat, we lost our fortress we spent years building up, and we must move to try and save it." In 28 days, Benham Brothers would get back to Sovereignty 3, and it could once again prevent Goonswarm from bridging in its dreadnoughts, carriers, and titans. Until then, Benham Brothers was vulnerable. Goonswarm had 28 days to conquer Delve, or else much of this great feat of spy work would be lost. The day after the entire structure of Band of Brothers alliance was torn to pieces, Goonswarm took a victory lap. The Mittani, aka Mittens, took to the Eve forums to parade this historical victory in front of the entire Eve community in the most obnoxious tone he could manage. I quote, "Hello, I am Mitten, a mighty space tyrant. I focus my space tyranny on the very important job of being warm and fuzzy. Today we destroyed the BOB. The new BOB alliance is run by Goon Waffle. You can remake another alliance, I guess, but we took your name and ticker. Oh, and your sovereignty everywhere will drop. Hope this helps. Also, we took everything BNC had. Thanks for the free capital fleet, starbases, and ISK. Oh, and I forgot also, we archived your entire director forum and will be publishing it. Barros de la Jefes, more like Barros de la Onde. Bye." Oh my god. He's so petty. In some ways. That was my cat voice. In some ways, this message from the Mittani was a typical Goon Swarm response. Goon Swarm pilots like to hide their skills and act as if they were barely paying attention. It seems to have been their way of rubbing salt in their enemies' wounds, a way of making their enemies feel like they were losing to an alliance that wasn't even taking this seriously. Behind the gloating, Goon Swarm was all business. Its leaders wanted the rest of the Eve community to believe they had scored a one-shot kill on Band of Brothers, but the truth was that Delve still had to be conquered. The Eve Online community was sent reeling by the news, which was so earth-shaking that it made its way into international mainstream news sources. The denizens of Eve were aghast that espionage could be used with such staggering potency, and many felt that the community had entered a new age. However, not everyone was thrilled with Goonswarm. Some within the community, particularly veteran players, believe that conflicts in EVE should be solved through straightforward in-game warfare. Many of the Band of Brothers allies were disgusted by what they viewed as a craven act of subterfuge. The Empire, now known as Genzoku, was still trying to figure out exactly what had happened. At the time, nobody but Goonswarm really knew how Band of Brothers had been betrayed. Suffice to say, the former Band of Brothers leaders were a little upset when they found out the real story. They were also left wondering why the game mechanics allowed someone to disband the Alliance without calling a vote, even though many other Alliance level actions triggers a vote in EVE Online. In the wake of one of the most significant events in EVE history, leader Diabonol Kenzoku leader Dianabolic appeared as a guest in a segment on the internet radio station EVE Radio to explain what had happened and to show what Kenzoku's resolve to fight had not waned. I quote, "We're pretty defenseless, certainly for a week until sovereignty kicks in, and to our enemy regardless of how this came about, whether it was legitimate or not, we look forward to the fight," said Band of Brothers co-leader Dianabolic in an appearance with host DJ Funky Bacon. Still quoting, "Because of the moment, we're pretty much stood here naked, and if Goonswarm can't capitalize on this, guys and girls, if you can't finally do what you've committed your game to doing for the last, I don't even know many years, then you really are as terrible at this game as you say you are." In that radio appearance, Dianabolic confirmed that there were already raiding gangs of 100 or so goonship inside Kenzoku's territory, attacking, attacking its installations. Goonswarn and its ally Pandemic Legion were already on the move, but their small numbers showed how hasty the Harkani heist really was. There was no time to coordinate a large-scale assault to capitalize on it, but this point in history, 100 ships had become a small force. While the invasion of the former Band of Brothers territory was just heating up, the War of Words was in full swing. Not long after the heist, the Mittani and Dianabolic appeared in a radio interview together. The two sparred verbally, trading insults and testy sarcasm. The Mittani did his best to sound disengaged and aloof, in keeping with his public persona, while Dianabolic tried to seem in high spirits while doing his best to insult the Mittani at every turn. At one point in the testy hour-long live interview, the Mittani began reading an excerpt from the Band of Brothers forums, stolen in the heist, written by Band of Brothers pilot. The title of the post is "We're Crap," read the Mittani, attempting to embarrass Diabolic. Security, ... crap. Bob pilot participation, crap. Counterintelligence, crapper than crap. Pilot skills level, crap. Fleet commanders, non-Bob are all crap. Face it, guys, in my opinion, we've become something we should have never become, and it makes me cry looking at our fleets right now. We really should think about the options we have from this point on. In my opinion, a completely new vision is needed. In short, restructure and reset. The writer clearly believed that Band of Brothers had recruited too many unskilled players and diluted the Alliance's culture, and the only solution was to rebuild from scratch. The Mittani smugly noted that he was more than happy to provide the reset that this Band of Brother pilot was looking for. He also added that he would be releasing more from the forum archive as time went on. Genzoku's leader decided to get out in front of this and release the forum archives themselves to safeguard against being taken out of context. No sooner had they done this than the Mittani announced it was all a trick. He claimed he only ever acquired a section of their forums before the archiving software malfunctioned. He released what he had as a deception to goad Kenzoku into giving up the rest of the information. It's really unknown whether the Mittani was telling the truth, or if he was just wanted everyone to think he had fooled Kenzoku again. Either way, it was a public relation victory. Goon Swarm once again looked like the intelligence masterminds, while Kenzoku came off as a waning organization that was easily duped. Now the Band of Brothers' formerly private forums were out in the open. Every internal discussion its members had ever had about Ally was now public information, and Goonswarm agents combed the documents for any stray comments that might drive a wedge between Kenzoku and its allies. This gambit had minimal effects. Kenzoku's allies may not have been happy about what Kenzoku's leaders had been saying about them behind their backs, but most of Kenzoku's allies were disgusted that Goonswarm had pulled that stunt in the first place. After what Goonswarm did to Band of Brothers, these allies had no doubt who their real enemy was. Carthago Dolande Est. While the Goonswarm intelligence agency kept up its psychological attacks, the massive Goonswarm war machine was gearing up for the invasion of Delph. The clock was ticking, and Goonswarm chose to put itself in a position where it wouldn't be able to retreat, even if it wanted to. It was Delve or bust. After years of warring with Band of Brothers, Goonswarm leader Darius Johnson saw a chance to put an end to everything. He knew Goonswarm had accomplished something big, and he wasn't about to give Band of Brothers a chance to recover. 2 years of hate and war had turned this into Eve's greatest blood feud, and the goons wouldn't rest until it was over. When they met to discuss their next move, Darius Johnson made the most brazen decision in EVE Online history. The goons would abandon all their territory. They would pack up every single ship and starbase and move the entire Alliance straight into Delph. Goonswarm would house the Alliance in the NPC station in Delph that the newly named Kenzoku couldn't control, and from there it would strike non-stop for as long as it took to destroy Kenzoku forever. All of Goonswarm's former territory was packed up and abandoned. Everything that couldn't be brought to Delph was destroyed, and the vast Goon Empire was left vacant. Darius Johnson even invoked the legacy of the Spanish conquistador Hernan Cortés, who famously scuttled his army's ship on the shores of Mexico, so there could be no retreat or deserters. When the goons arrived in Delve, they rendezvoused with the other organization that would aid them in their conquest. Pandemic Legion and the Northern Coalition as the target of Band of Brothers' maximum damage campaign, Northern Coalition was thrilled to join the fight to take down its old enemies. Delve is a unique region of conquerable space, not only because it has higher income potential than any other region in New Eden, but also because it contains a sub-region of NPC, owned by non-players characters, stations where anyone can dock without restriction. The Metani wrote in a war retrospective, the Coalition invasion of Delph was staged from 319-3D, Goonswarm, UHKLN, the Northern Coalition, and GTT5V, Pandemic Legion, those systems in NPC Delph. Each coalition alliance parked a Titan in one of these staging systems and used their jump bridges to quickly move fleets and reinforce battles in progress. The allies organized themselves and spread out across Delph. Each of them targeted one of the constituent corporation of Kenzoku, attacking the constellation of star systems that were their fiefdoms. The hope was that by attacking each corporation's home, they might encourage one of them or more of them to leave the war front entirely. In the early days, one of the most vital locations in Kenzoku territory was JTAC LPX-7, the headquarters of the Reikoku Corporation. JLP was the location of several capital shipyards that were busy building motherships and titans. Goonswarm put the system in a state of round-the-clock siege, with some major engagements taking upward of 6 hours. Neither was willing to see the field of battle, and both had stockpiles of replacement ships just a few jumps away, and so they clashed again and again. In the chaos of this week-long battle, Goonswarm was able to destroy several Kenzoku shipyards that were confirmed to be building titans. These types of blows undermined the Kenzoku's ability to reinforce its fleets. These failures, I quote, resulted in a significant swing in morale from the Kenzoku side towards the coalition, wrote the Mittani in retrospect. 1 week into the 28-day invasion timeline, Kenzoku allies against all authorities, Stain Empire, Atlas, and Red Overlord were moving into the vacated Goon Swarm territory, freely conquering Fifth Abolus, Impasse, Omist, Esoteria, and Paragon Soul. This huge territory was vacant and defenseless, but it still took a great deal of time to tear down the remainder of the Goon Swarm star bases left behind. These alliances repeatedly asked Kenzoku if they should break off their annexation of former Goon lands to aid in the defense of Delve. Kenzoku refused their offer. No, finish the job first, Sormoli told them. He knew that if Kenzoku could hold the line in Delve while its allies took all of the Goon's old space in the south, then Goon Swarm would be left homeless and broken. There was no peace treaty or stalemate coming. Both of these coalitions were fighting for the other's complete destruction. And then the 9-tack CG slugfest. Genzoku knew it needed to get back on the offensive and draw the fight away from Delve. It chose the system 9CG6-TAC-H, the capital system in the nearby region Quarius, for the site of its counterattack. Kenzoku took a risk and decided to bring a large contingent of its dreadnought fleet into territory previously conquered by the Northern Coalition. If this maneuver failed, it would severely hamper Kenzoku's ability to defend Delve, but if it succeeded, it could create the breathing room Kenzoku needed to force its enemies back to secure Delve and run out the ever-ticking sovereignty clock. Genzoku arrived in 9CG with 220 ships, including 70 dreadnoughts, an imposing force, but also it couldn't afford to lose. The fleet glided into position in front of the first target, a Goon Swarm starbase, and began setting up the dreadnoughts for the siege, and that's when the Goon Swarm sprung its trap. The Goons arrived at the head of a 350-ship fleet comprised of pilots from Northern Coalition, Pandemic Legion, and other allies. The fleet's 140 carriers and dreadnoughts hot-dropped directly onto the Kenzoku fleet and opened fire with a force that would soon double that of Kenzoku's. Kenzoku was outnumbered, but it had committed everything to this attack, and it wasn't about to run away and let half of its dreadnought fleet, stuck in siege mode, be shot down in the retreat. At the head of the Kenzoku fleet, Sormoli gave the order for his ships to stand their ground and fight for 9CG. Their nearly 600 ships of both fleet form an enormous blob in the skies of 9CG, laser firing crisscross the circular mass of ships. Both fleets targeted each other's dreadnoughts at close range, and the blob of ships was occasionally disrupted by a flash of light as the whole kilometer-long ships fell one by one. By the numbers, Kenzoku lost the battle. About 70 out of his 220 of its ships went down during the fighting, including two-thirds of the dreadnought fleet it had brought into the battle. But Kenzoku managed to exact a heavy toll upon its enemies as well. Its pilots destroyed around 50 enemy ships, including 15 dreadnoughts. The next day, the fighting began more fiercely than ever. Back in Delve at Kenzoku headquarters in JTAC LPX-7, the two sides waged a long, slow battle over 8 hours that reportedly destroyed more than 1,000 ships in constant battle. Just as the fight was beginning to cool down, the Goon Swarm capital fleet spotted a Kenzoku mothership out of position near a Stargate. Goons warped by the dozen to the mothership as quickly as possible and tore its hull as Kenzoku hastily rushed in reinforcement. By the end, the Goons had destroyed the mothership and all of the reinforcements. Mere hours later, Sormoli himself was flying in the Kenzoku defense fleet when he made a mistake and warped his Titan to the wrong starbase, accidentally flying himself directly into the staging ground of a Goon Swarm fleet. Are you serious? Isn't this like the second time you messed up the Titan? Was not Sir Molly the driver of the first Titan ever? I'll have to go back. I haven't read this in a while, but damn. The Titan was quickly warp scrambled and destroyed. Goon Swarm propagandists worked overtime broadcasting that the figurehead of Kenzoku had lost his fourth Titan. Yeah, that was him. Okay. The massive losses on this. At the same time, I'm feeling like since he's one of the first to have driven the Titan, right? Like he was always the driver. So if someone is gonna lose Titan, is the Titan drivers. It's not just gonna be someone else. They were just using whoever had the most skill points for it, and that was obviously him. The massive losses on, but he kept messing up. The massive losses on this day may be to blame for the egregious mistake that was to come. Genzoku ordered every one of its capital ship pilots to log off at an open NPC controlled station in PR TAC 8CA in Delve. This would afford them the ability to stay highly organized in a central defensive position. However, Goonswarm spies found out about the massive stockpile of warships and called in their allies to organize a massive blockade of the station. They were able to surround the indestructible NPC station, trapping every last one of Kenzoku's dreadnoughts and carriers inside. The blockade of PR-8, dubbed a Hell Camp, was kept up around the clock, and this gave Goonswarm the chance to do as it pleased inside Delve. No doubt the Goon leaders enjoyed the fact that this blockade so closely mirrored the first shot Band of Brothers fired in this conflict years ago, when it blockaded the Goons inside their stations in Syndicate. Before this mistake, the Goons were 2 weeks into their invasion and halfway to their deadline, and they had only made moderate gains. Now, with Kenzoku's entire capital fleet taken prisoner, Goonswarm could act with impunity. A coordinated effort was undertaken to destroy every piece of Kenzoku hardware they could find. What was once an epic battle became an operation for logisticians and engineers. Rather than massing for confrontations to destroy star bases, the coalition of invading forces was acting like a wrecking crew. The pilots worked in shifts throughout all hours of the day to fly out the areas of Delve and take down specific star bases. After the capture of Kenzoku's capital fleet, I don't have my bot set up. I have a mammal bot for a while ago that I still need to grab back. There's so much, as you know, to do. And yeah. I didn't even remember because I have MooBot set up somewhere and I was just about to work on this today actually. And then you mentioned that and I was like, hey, I remember MammalBot. Where is that guy? And now I have to find that again. So yeah, you're the one giving me work now, so we're switching roles. Alright. After the capture of Kenzoku's capital fleet, Delve was taken. Kenzoku couldn't regain sovereignty, and Goonswarm now held sway over the entire region. The blockade around Kenzoku's fleet held for 30 days straight, even after the fall of Delve, but help was on the way. Evil Thug returns, having completed the conquest of Goonswarm's former territory against all authorities. Aklis, Red Overlord, and Stain Empire were finally making their way into Delve to aid the embattled Kenzoku. The whole of the EVE universe was wondering why it had taken them a month to come to the aid of their allies. From a historical perspective, it seems clear that Kenzoku's southern allies had been left with an embarrassment of riches when Goonswarm vacated the southern regions. Against all authorities, and the other Kenzoku allies needed to safeguard their own future in case they weren't able to save Kenzoku from the enemy forces of Goonswarm, Pandemic Legion, and the Northern Coalition. Once against all authorities had captured those profitable regions, only then did they make their own way to PR-8 to save Kenzoku. Regardless of their allies' tardiness, Kenzoku now had the help it needed, and its first priority was clear. It needed to rescue the capital fleet within PR-8. With the aid of their allies, Kenzoku finally removed the blockade. The goons had staffed it with hundreds of people around the clock, but they didn't defend it with heavy hardware. The blockade's frigates, battleships, and cruisers were dwarfed by the carriers, dreadnoughts, and titans that against all authorities and its allies Stand Empire Red Overlord brought to the attack. Kenzoku's capital fleet was now free, but its home was gone. In a bid to take back its territory, Kenzoku linked up with allied bases in Catch and Stain and began to fight westward. Is the music too loud, by the way? I forgot to ask. It couldn't evict the goon-led coalition with a single big hit, so it adopted the posture of a bulldozer and began pushing from Catch into Aquarius, one station at a time. I quote, "Invigorated by the influx of allies, Kenzoku began plotting to take its space back," wrote Goonswarm's the Mitani in his retrospective. I keep quoting. "On the border between Catch and Aquarius, 49 TAC U6U became the fulcrum of the next phase of the war. A system a mere 3 jumps from against all authorities' regional capital in FAT TAC 6P in Catch. A classic time zone war broke out. In the hours after downtime and through European prime time, 49 TAC U6U would be packed with hundreds of Kenzoku and against all authority pilots, sieging coalition towers. In the later hours of US and NZAC time zone, the coalition would return the favor. Given the overwhelming superiority in each alliance's prime time, very little direct conflict occurred. In the strain of a month-long war, Goon Swarm eventually made some crucial mistakes. Exhausted by a month and a half of desperate conquests, Goon Swarm logistics began to crack under the strain, wrote the Mitani. Errors in timing towers resulted in 49 TAC falling to Kenzoku on April 4th. 3BK, another station in Aquarius, fell to a combined surprise attack by Kenzoku. Against all authorities and Red Overlord, 3BK TAC 07 hadn't been fully purged of hostile towers and was taken without a fight, written off as a loss by the coalition. Sarmoli seized the moment to trumpet his return and the impending doom of Goonswarm. I quote, "We are after your blood," he wrote. "We will kill you." Kenzoku had good reason to be confident. After years of being one step behind the work of the Goonswarm intelligence agency, it had scored an espionage victory on its own. Aromai, a high-ranking Goonswarm official, was now serving as a Kenzoku spy. Aromai was careful never to be too bold in his spy work. He made sure his actions could pass as bad luck or negligence. He would secretly defuel star bases in good system. He would make sure Goon assets went missing from time to time, and covertly let his band of brothers handler know whether a Goon Titan was separated from the fleet and vulnerable to a hit-and-run attack. But Iromai was ready for his first real act of sabotage. He was planning to steal a Titan. He had convinced Goonswarm that the next Titan they built should belong to him, and as soon as it was launched, he planned to abscond with it to Band of Brothers space once and for all. But his handler and Band of Brothers had one last job for him. There was a station inside Goonswarm space that had been conquered before Band of Brothers could evacuate all of its ships and assets. Iromai's handler wanted him to shut down the star bases in that system so that their defenses would drop and the assets could be liberated. After all, Iromai's mischief to this point, the goons had become suspicious. The goons kept an eye on him, and when he attempted to shut down the star bases, they caught him red-handed. He was instantly removed from the Alliance, and the Titan he would have commanded was allocated to another leader. Kenzoku leaders were furious that the spy's cover was blown in a risky operation to recover lost assets when he was just weeks away from being able to steal a Titan, a far more valuable prize. Kenzoku needed that Titan too. When Kenzoku lost Delve, it also lost its entire moon mining network, all of its shipyards, and any significant source of income. Income was especially important now because the ferocity of the fighting was driving up the prices of materials throughout New Eden. Resources scarcity became a challenge for everyone as the new war consumed ships as fast as the rest of New Eden could build them. At a time when the player base numbered around 300,000, over 30,000 players are reported to have participated directly in the fight, and tens of thousands of ships were destroyed in the war for Delve. Normally, an alliance's morale breaks long before its wallet runs dry. But these alliances had been fighting for so long that they were beginning to worry about running out of money. This was particularly problematic for Kenzoku, which no longer had any territories or means of production. A great deal of its remaining income was coming from an ally called Executive Outcomes, which held most of period bases to the south. There, it controlled a set of valuable moons which were still producing money for the Alliance. The Goonsworn-led coalition saw this vulnerability and focused its attention on period bases. Kenzoku was focused on Aquarius and didn't defend the region. Goonswarm attacked, and the region, Kenzoku's last source of money, fell on May 3rd. The Goons and their allies then turned their attention to Aquarius. Four months into the war, 4 months into the war from the southwest, both coalition found themselves fighting new enemies: exhaustion and apathy. Pilots on both sides were tired. Their leaders did whatever they could to lift their spirits and keep them motivated. Goon leaders told their pilots that they risked losing everything. Risk losing everything they'd fought for if they didn't wipe Kenzoku once and for all. The motivational propaganda worked, and Goonswarm fleet numbers began to rise as they swept Kenzoku back out of Aquarius. Station after station fell back into the hands of Goonswarm, Pandemic Legion, and Northern Coalition forces. Kenzoku and its allies couldn't muster the opposition to stem the tide. The two adversaries were exhausted, but in this final month of combat, Goonswarm proved the more resilient of the two. Its pilots kept pushing again until they evicted Kenzoku from its last strongholds in Aquarius. On June 16, 2009, it was over. Dianabolic, co-leader of Kenzoku, broadcast a message to the Alliance's pilots to get their gear out of their last station they still had held in Aquarius. Hours later, Sarmoli confirmed the retreat while throwing a bit of shade at his allies for not helping enough. "Vacate your stuff," he says. "As it is, we are playing the sacrificial lamb the whole time. We're not doing that anymore. Pull your stuff out from 4-9 TACU and Delve. That's the standing orders. Place it safely somewhere and we'll work from there. Expect no ops for a week." The Great Eve War was finally over. Kenzoku was out of resources, out of manpower, out of cash, and out of options. No retaking of the Southwest. Kenzoku was defeated. After years of warring to evict Band of Brothers from the Southwest, the Allied Coalition was victorious. Pandemic Legion, Northern Coalition, Goonsworn gathered in 49U to celebrate. They brought every Titan their alliances owned, 20 in total, and blasted off Doomsday like fireworks. A new era at dawn in EVE Online, and this celebration was its ominous harbinger. As the allies who destroyed Band of Brothers showed off their mutual might, all of the old powers were now dead, and the victors of the Great War were now destined to become the undisputed lords of Nullsec, until they once again once again found themselves at odds. After the war, Chapter 19. In the wake of Kenzoku's retreat from the south, the New Eden star cluster became a much different place. For most of Nullsec history prior to the Great War, politics tended to revolve around Band of Brothers. It was the principal aggressor in many of the most important wars of the first half of the game's history, and now it was gone, a whole new paradigm dawned. Goon Swarm emerged as easily the most powerful single alliance. However, it was instantly struck by a difficult problem, figuring out what to do now that Band of Brothers Kenzoku was effectively gone. Goon Swarm ranks had swelled during the years-long holy war against Band of Brothers, as people arrived to fight in what Goon Swarm sometimes jokingly referred to as the glorious war of patriotic righteousness against the evil tyranny of Bob. The war had gone on so long that many goons had never experienced EVE Online before the Great War. Within the year of the end of the Great War, Goon Swarm fell on hard times, and the power balance in Nullsec once again shifted. The Northern Coalition and the Russian alliances, now lords of the drone regions, inherited massive power after the two principal forces in the Great War began to wane from the stress of that truly global conflict. The history of the ensuing 2 years is the story of the rise of the Russian coalition, informally known as the Drone Russian Federation, and the dawn of hostilities between it and the Northern Coalition as the game's two preeminent power blocks once again came into conflict. Sarmoli and Dianabolic weren't down for long. Even with Genzoku defeated, they still considered their mission to return to Delve and retake their home from Goonswarm. To do so, they formed the IT Alliance, and they emulated the Goonswarm style of battle, smothering opponent with mass numbers of pilots. They recruited thousands of players that would eventually reclaim Delve after the near-internal collapse of Goonswarm left Delve vacant. However, IT Alliance would never even approach the level of infamy and dominance that Band of Brothers once did. Many of the stories explored in this book are still evolving to this day. Sormoli still plays EVE Online, although his notoriety is no longer what it once was, and his alliance is still at odds with Goonswarm, which is now led by the Mittani. The Mittani is still famous for his role in orchestrating the Great Band of Brothers disbandment. Goonswarm, after finding its way back from near destruction, has been the vanguard of the most powerful coalition in Nullsec for 3 years as of this printing. In review, there is no shortage of amazing stories to be told from Nullsec, but our story ends here in the middle of 2009. Because the defeat of Band of Brothers and Kenzoku was an event such gravity in EVE Online that what happens after this is essentially a new story. This story began back in 2003 with the formation of the early power blocks: Evolution, Venal Alliance, Curse Alliance, Stain Alliance, Forsaken Empire, and Fallen Alliance. We then explored how those groups came into conflict over the ensuing 2 years leading to the great creation of Band of Brothers, the predominant military force that shaped the game from 2004 to 2007. The victory of Band of Brothers in these early conflicts had a powerful effect on the political state of the game. Their military-focused vision of Nullsec won out, but if others had been victorious, then the history of the game may have unfolded very differently. It is not a given that Nullsec would one day inevitably descend into total war. For instance, had someone like Jade Constantine stayed in power, then the policy of Nullsec may have gravitated toward peace and openness. In the wake of those early regional wars that shaped the political policy of the game for years to come, 2004 and 2005 brought new recruits into New Eden with the arrival of Ascendance, Frontier, and the first major influx of goons. The resultant population boom forced every group in Nullsec to expand their membership in order to maintain a grip on power. The best leaders steadily learn how to command, organize coalition of thousands of players. The following 2 years dealt with how the entrenched powers in Nullsec, specifically bands of Brother, Lotka Volterra, Red Alliance, and the nascent Northern Coalition, dealt with this population surge and new empires it created. Goonswarn and Ascended Frontier. Each of them made their voices, and those choices echoed through the rest of the game's history. Even in modern times, the distribution of power in Nullsec can arguably be charted back to political decision made 10 years earlier. For instance, if Band of Brothers had worked together with Ascendant Frontier and Lotka Volterra in 2006 to crush Red Swarm Federation before it gained a foothold in the southeast, there may never have been a great war at all. Had Goonswarm not had the foresight to ally itself with the then struggling Red Alliance, then certainly much would have been different. Both Goon and Russian cultures may never have been able to thrive in Nullsec the way they have. Had the Northern Coalition not committed itself to working together with Red Swarm Federation to destroy Band of Brothers, then the Great War may have had an entirely different outcome. Had Goonswarm not perfectly navigated the difficult 2007 political landscape, then it may never have acquired the power it currently enjoys in modern Nullsec. The Great War of EVE Online was the most expensive and intense war ever fought over the internet at the time. The leaders of this conflict created political coalitions that rallied more than 30,000 people around the common cause of destroying their enemies, regardless of the fact that this event took place in a digital environment. These leaders and ideologies matter to history. Whether in a digital or physical realm, the feat of bringing together tens of thousands of people toward a common pursuit is something that deserves to be recognized and documented as unique in human history. In what I have covered, I have taken great pains to ensure that the events portrayed in this story are as accurate as possible, and have enlisted the help of more than a dozen fact-checkers from the EVE community. This is the first time all of these events have been brought together in a single narrative. This book is not meant to be comprehensive history of the EVE community, but rather a first step toward documenting one part of it, Nullsec. These stories follow the action of hundreds of thousands of people, but the majority of EVE Online community is not represented. In order to explain the fascinating story of Nullsec, I've had to sadly ignore most of what has happened in HighSec, LowSec, and Wormhole space. Even many events in Nullsec were by necessity not included in this book. Future historians of EVE Online will find there is still a wealth of amazing stories about the people of New Eden still waiting to be told. This is the first history book about EVE Online, but it is my greatest hope that it will not be the last. And this is it. Awesome. So that recording is done. Thank you very much for people tuning in onto YouTube if you're watching from over there. Feel free to look at my socials up there and come over to Twitch and have some fun with us and the rest of the chat. Have a good one.